everyone. Apologies for the delay due to the technical difficulties. Thank you very much for your patience. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to our webinar. I hope everyone is doing well. I am Angeline, BMCC's Communications and Public Relations Manager, and I will be your MC today. Welcome to the Malaysia Economic Outlook and Post-Budget 2023 Forum, organized by the British Malaysia Chamber of Commerce in partnership with the Malaysian French Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Ladies and gentlemen, last Friday, the Right Honourable Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Dato Seri Anwar Ibrahim, tabled the 2023 budget in Parliament. Today, we are proud to have the newly appointed Treasury Secretary General Yang Berbahagia, Dato Johan Merican, here with us to share his views into the budget and as a member of our panel with speakers from the BMCC and CCI France Malaysia. To start off today's program, we are pleased to welcome Mark Arthur, the Chairman of British Malaysia Chamber of Commerce and the Managing Director and Site Leader of Smith & Nephew Operations Sendirian Berhad, to deliver his welcome remarks. Over to you, Mark.
Dato Johan Merican, Treasury Secretary General of the Ministry of Finance, Malaysia. Dato Zainal Aminshah, Chairman of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, France and Malaysia. Fellow board members and members of the BMCC. And to our webinar audience. A very good afternoon and welcome. First, before we start, I want to extend our heartiest congratulations to Dato Johan on your appointment as the Secretary General of the Treasury just a couple of days ago. We greatly appreciate you for carving out time out of your busy schedule for this in this dialogue that we are discussing, which is the retabled 2023 budget, which is currently being debated in Parliament. On behalf of the BMCC, I'd like to extend our appreciation to Dato Zainal and the CCIFM team for the partnership in organizing this annual Malaysia Economic Outlook and Post-Budget. Our appreciation to all of our speakers as well, Amarjit Singh and Xiao Yang from EY, Anthony Lowe from BNP Paribas, and Kiranjit Singh from Ipsos. Thank you also to the officers from the Ministry of Finance for joining our session today. Ladies and gentlemen, we highly commend the Unity Government on their first budget, which is pragmatic and one that is well balanced in focusing on the well-being of the people, as well as one that supports Malaysia's efforts in promoting, defending, and protecting the country's interests in the world stage. Through the Budget 2023, we clearly see the government's commitment to driving the country's economic recovery towards ensuring the continued development of Malaysia for the well-being of the people in line with the concept Malaysia Madani. The ringgit Malaysian 1.585 billion allocated for trade and investment is a testament that the government is committed to planning the country's development in an inclusive and holistic manner, which would further strengthen Malaysia's position as a designation of choice for investment and trade, as well as a gateway to the Asian region. In addition, we welcome the government's recognition for the evolution of Malaysia's incentives in light of the changes in global trends, technological advancements, and growing focus on climate change. BMCC is very appreciative of the government for taking in feedback from investors to ease business operations in Malaysia. We hope the government puts urgency and will act swiftly in their commitment to improve processes, reduce bureaucracy, as was announced in the budget, which will further boost investors' confidence. The BMCC also fully supports the government's commitments towards enhancing public-private collaborations to accelerate economic growth and attract investment to create jobs in Malaysia. In addition, we applaud the focus in areas such as sustainability and ESG, supporting SMEs, digitalization, and developing the talent landscape in Malaysia, which are very much aligned with the Chamber's and our members' priorities. On the topic of talent, we're proud to have recently set up the Talent Network within the BMCC, bringing together leaders responsible for talent to discourse on the current challenges in talent attraction and development. It is our aim through this collaborative effort to collectively work together with stakeholders to bridge the gap for the nation. As we are also pleased to collaborate with and are appreciative of the Talent Corp's efforts at being attentive and perceptive of the industry's needs and for supporting and addressing our areas of concerns in this nation building exercise. The Chamber is committed to supporting the government's aspirations and looks to continue to work with the government and its relevant agencies to drive these efforts forward. Ladies and gentlemen, we trust today's forum will provide greater insights into the budget 2023 from Dato Johan, the main person working behind it with his dedicated team, and the subject matter experts from EY, as well as all from the industry leaders in their views from a business perspective. With that, thank you again, Dato Johan. Congratulations again. And with all our esteemed speakers, I wish everyone an insightful session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Next, I would like to invite Dato Zainal Aman Shah, Chairman of CCI France Malaysia, to deliver his speech.
Thank you, Angeline. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yang berbahagia Dato American, Treasury Secretary General, Ministry of Finance, Mr. Mark Arthur, Chairman of British Malaysia Chamber of Commerce, my colleagues and members of Chamber of Commerce and Industry France Malaysia, and British Malaysia Chamber of Commerce, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. Bonjour, selamat datang. Thank you, Mark, for your kind words and the complete introduction of today's program. On behalf of CCI France Malaysia, welcome to all participants. And thank you, Mark and Jennifer at the BMCC and today's event entitled Malaysia's Post-Budget Economic Outlook for 2023. Congratulations, Dato Johan, on your appointment as the Treasury Secretary General. Not so long ago, when you were heading Talent Corp and I was at InvestScale, that we were collaborating, and great to see you progress very far in the Ministry of Finance. Thank you to all the panelists and also the attendees for attending today's event on the discussion of the new government's first budget since being elected. Trade between times was about 5 billion euros or 20 during COVID. As expected, it dropped a little bit to about 2.3 billion euros or 10 billion ringgit. So it shows that there's a lot of potential to do more. The number of French companies in Malaysia is about 500, 350 subsidiary companies, 150 entrepreneurs, employing approximately 35,000 people. More than 90% are Malaysians. Many companies have made KL and Malaysia its base for the region, such as ST Microelectronics, Decathlon, Saint-Gobain, Stellantis, Air-Liquide, Veolia, to name a few. We're excited with the 2023 budget based on the concept of Malaysia Madani. And just to mention a few key highlights for us. Number one, the budget adopted a targeted approach to attract high impact foreign investment. Number of digitalization and reform measures were introduced to improve the government delivery system and ease of doing business in Malaysia. This is, of course, one of the topmost criteria for investors to choose KL and Malaysia, ease of doing business. Number two, we applaud the government for allocating the biggest amount of the budget to the Ministry of Education and to develop talent of the future. And talent, of course, is another key important criteria for investors and also our members as we expand our business. Number three is the strong emphasis on SMEs, and this is important because of the ecosystem. So besides ease of doing business talent, the vibrant ecosystem in Malaysia is also another attractive factor for us. And number four, the incentives and funds to support the development of tourism. The tourism sector recovery is great because livability is another attractive feature of Malaysia. So the key ingredients of ease of doing business, talent, SMEs as part of the ecosystem, and enhancing tourism should create a stable and sustainable business environment for livability. This is indeed exciting, and CCIFM is here to support the Malaysian government and key stakeholders, including the Invest Malaysia Council, key agencies such as, among others, MIDA, Invest KL, Invest Selangor, MDEC, and Talent Corp, as we grow the economy together. Dato Johan, your presence today is very important for our respective business communities, and it represents the close relationship with the Malaysian Public Service and administration that is always open for dialogue and understanding. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule. Thank you once again to all for joining us, and thank you to our panelists, our partner BMCC, and our members BNP Paribas and Ipsos for their support to this event. Thank you, merci, terima kasih, and have a good event. Thank you.
Dato Zainal. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very honored to welcome Yang Berbahagia Dato Johan Merican, Treasury Secretary General of the Ministry of Finance Malaysia, to deliver his keynote address on the National Budget 2023 towards a sustainable, compassionate, innovative and prosperous Malaysia. Dato Johan, please.
Thank you, Angeline. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Very good afternoon. Mr. Mark Arton, BMCC Chair, Dato Zainal Amansyah, CCIFM Chair, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me to have this opportunity perhaps to share a little bit about some of the thinking and intentions of Budget 2023. So just to give an overview of the budget, which you know, Yang Amat Berhormat Dato Seri Anwar Ibrahim had tabled the budget. And when he tabled the budget, he started off by setting out the challenges that face the country, amongst others, high national debt, a more challenging global economic outlook, issues around bureaucracy, corruption, in terms of competitiveness, and also the challenges in terms of cost of living facing the rakyat. And in this respect, what then was then articulated by Yang Amat Prime Minister is the need for a holistic approach in transforming the country. And he's obviously had earlier introduced the Membangun Malaysia Madani, or the Madani concept. But in translating the Madani to Budget 2023, we then focus on three main thrusts. The first being in terms of the elements of sustainable and prosperity within the Madani, and that encapsulates in terms of driving economic growth that's both inclusive and sustainable. Second is in terms of innovation and trust, and this is a lot about reforming, and particularly in terms of the public service delivery system, our institutions and governance, particularly in terms of restoring confidence of both the rakyat and investors. And then third, in terms of social justice, this is where in terms of the focus towards at combating inequality amongst others, hardcore poor, and also addressing the broader cost of living for B40 and also M40. So allow me first to just run through some of the challenges that Yang Amat Ibrahim was talking about. But first, in terms of national debt. So you can see on the left that national debt has effectively will reach 1.2 trillion at the end of this year, which is more than 60% of GDP. As you know, for the longest time, we were subject to a statutory debt limit ceiling of 55%, which we increased to 65% during the COVID crisis. Subsequently, what faces us is also not just a case of looking at our debt as a function of GDP, but also seeing in terms of our affordability. And in that respect, our debt service charges for this year, it's increasing to 46 billion, which is it's equivalent to 16% of our revenues. And that's certainly relatively high, because given that for the longest time, MOF would maintain a 15% administrative ceiling as part of managing our fiscal position. So this really, in terms of coming back to the other challenge in terms of the global outlook, as we know, each time the IMF has revised its outlook, it always seems to be going downhill. Even if you look at global growth back in April, it targeted 3.6%, and then most recently in January, it's now 2.9%. But I guess of more concern for a trading economy like Malaysia, back in April, they're projecting 4.4% trade growth this year, but based on the latest in January, it's now only 2.4%. Obviously, Malaysia as an open trading economy cannot be exempt from such global developments. In terms of our actual growth, obviously in 2022, we've had record high 8.7% growth, but partly that's on the back of a low base of 2021 and the reopening of the economy. And in line with the moderation in terms of global outlook, hence the target of 4.5%. I think as many know, many analysts are targeting like World Bank and Fitch around 4%, but we feel strongly that given the actual strength, even at the end of 2022 in terms of strong private consumption, we're confident of our 4.5%. And the Prime Minister stated he's even more confident in exceeding the 4.5% on the back of the reforms that are being undertaken by the government, and also the very strong reception by international investors that he's been engaging with. This in terms of inflation. Yes, our inflation looks quite contained at 3.3% compared, I guess, in UK it's about crossed 10% at times. But obviously underlying the average is inflation in terms of food items has reached 5.8%, which obviously affects the poor. So we're quite cognizant, despite a relatively contained level of inflation, that there's still challenges, particularly on the lower income. In terms of unemployment, we're happy that we've gone back to full employment, being now at 3.6% based on the fourth quarter of 2022. But certainly, there are also issues in terms of youth unemployment, where those under 25 being the fresh graduates and school leavers, unemployment there remains above 10%, hence some of the budget measures targeted at that group. So this is a busy slide. Sorry if it appears small on your screen, but along the three thrusts of economic growth, institution and governance and social justice, the budget obviously articulated support measures. Maybe if I can just maybe share some of the key messaging from the Prime Minister and the budget there being perhaps a first step towards the government's reform agenda. I think in the thrust relating to economic growth, I think first, the Prime Minister has clearly positioned this budget as a responsible budget, demonstrating that he's reduced the deficit from 5.6% to 5% this year. In fact, the earlier tabled budget on 7 October only targeted a fiscal deficit of 5.5%. So hence, I think the Prime Minister certainly has a stronger intention in terms of fiscal responsibility. And some may recall that the last time Malaysia had a surplus budget was when he was last finance minister. But whilst there is a strong commitment to fiscal consolidation, this budget remains an expansionary budget. There's certainly an increase in terms of our development expenditure, and that will be used, amongst others, the Prime Minister has spoken about programs to ensure basic infrastructure, including to rural areas, focus on poverty eradication, even some of the border developments around the country. So it's responsible but expansionary because Prime Minister believes further in terms of being pro-growth. And some of the areas that he's focusing include facilitating SMEs and also investments, taking into account that whilst GDP has recovered compared to pre-COVID levels, in private investments remain below. And I think that's also one key focus in terms of investment facilitation. In terms of institutions and governance, the government Prime Minister has emphasized very much in terms of improving government procurement transparency, the move towards tender, commitment to table the Government Procurement Act, also very much focus on wanting to see public service delivery being more facilitative, faster, and obviously with integrity, committing to, for example, to expedite the repairs of dilapidated schools and clinics around the country. And beyond that, this articulation that GLCs should be more strategic in terms of supporting national development and focus shouldn't be crowding out, but in fact crowd in private sector development. Moving on to social justice, a key part of it is in terms of first eradicating hardcore poor, providing support to the B40 and M40 amongst others through subsidies and assistance, and also in terms of looking at improving the social welfare or social protection system, especially for the informal sector, and also in terms of looking at ensuring there's development of less developed regions, for example, like Sabah and Sarawak. So that's an overall picture of the budget. One on growth, where government Prime Minister's position, fiscally responsible budget that is expansionary. Second, a very much key focus on transforming public sector delivery and the government governance of public sector, including JLCs. And the third, in terms of social justice, a focus on the less fortunate, also helping the masses in terms of cost of living. But then also you see obviously elements of progressive taxation, where in helping the broader population, the Prime Minister also believes that those who are more fortunate and high income should also partially contribute towards that. Now, we just cover just a couple of slides relating to some of these items next. I think first, in terms of fiscal position, so it's mentioned this reduction in fiscal deficit from 5.6 to 5.0. So in that sense, a more aggressive consolidation that was previously announced. But on the flip side, because of our improved revenue outlook compared to 7 October, we're actually pushing for higher development expenditure and also operating expenditure. The development expenditure obviously enables further investments into public infrastructure. There are obviously some measures to expand revenue base, but the Prime Minister said GST is not at this time, but it's looking obviously at some other issues like taxes on vapes, and also to study capital gains tax and potentially implement the luxury tax later this year. Next. So I think a key focus of the Prime Minister mentioning before is how private sector investments has not fully recovered post-COVID. This is where the Prime Minister is very much keen to further empower and really transform, for example, the role of Pemuda, really trying to see how we can transform the what are the focus areas in the private sectors and the incentives to support that, ensuring that we continue to able to attract, facilitate quality investments towards ensuring we develop or generate better jobs for our people. There's quite a few comments earlier from Mark and Zainal in terms of talent. So one of the things that Prime Minister mentioned in passing was this idea that for example, we send some scholars to do engineering in France, and there's no reason why we can perhaps match those scholars with some of our investors from France, have them do their internship and continue to serve their bond with those companies. You would have also heard the Prime Minister talking about TVET, where he's already looking at how can companies come in to help work with our public TVET institutions to ensure that the graduates that they produce really meet industry's requirements. So for example, getting Petronas to take over a TVET institution in Pengerang, DRB Highcom to take over TVET institution near Pekan, and perhaps we should be engaging with BMCC and CCIFM members along the same lines. I think this is just part, again, of the commitment for public sector reform. Many projects given out by direct negotiations will be retendered. The government then will also be tabling the Government Procurement Act and strengthening the Whistleblower Protection Act. In addition, announcements of how the Chief Secretary shall head a special task force on agency reform, looking to see, again, how can we make public service delivery faster, more facilitative, and obviously whilst upholding integrity. I think perhaps I'm conscious of time. Maybe let me just stop there, and perhaps further questions can be asked in terms of the overall look of the budget. Happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johan, for the insightful speech. Next, we would like to welcome Mr. Wong Chow Yang, partner from Ernst & Young Tax Consultants Sendirian Berhad, to share his thoughts and insights into Budget 23. Mr. Wong has more than 30 years of tax consulting experience, which extends to cross-border investments, mergers, acquisitions, privatizations, group restructurings, and transfer pricing matters. He joined the EY tax practice in 2015, adding a wealth of diverse tax knowledge and experience to help clients navigate through complex corporate tax issues and address tax risks and inefficiencies across a broad range of industries. Mr. Wong, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. A pleasure to be here. I would like to just share some of my thoughts on the budget 2023. I suppose some of the things that I was going to talk about, Dato Johan obviously went through it as well, but let me share my 2 cents worth of thoughts on this, on budget. Okay, I'll just run through the agenda for today. A couple of things I want to go through. Given the allocation of 25 minutes, I'm not going to go through obviously in detail in terms of, this is not a technical discussion. I would like to just run through an overview of the budget, and at a high level, to take a look at the structure, talk about the budget allocations and where certain gaps are, which from my point of view, and then we'll run through some of the key tax proposals, some things that are of interest, and finally we'll end with some other proposals which are not tax related, and I'll give my final thoughts on the budget as a whole. Okay, so firstly, overview and budget allocations. I think Dato Johan covered this earlier. Budget 2023 really is framed around three core pillars, namely, inclusiveness and on sustainable economic growth. Within there are quite a number of measures, but I've just highlighted three there because later on some of my slides, I will circle back to some of these points. The 3 points I wanted to highlight is, it talks about having responsible fiscal management, talks about sustainable growth and investments in food security. And what is important is attracting high impact investments, obviously for the economic growth of the country going forward, and creating all these ecosystems of high technology industries. And then secondly, the second pillar is on institutional reforms and good governance. Obviously, we talked about, Dato Johan mentioned this and Dato Zainal mentioned this as well, I think, to eliminate duplication of powers and functions and, make doing business in Malaysia easier. And within that whole agenda, there's this digital agenda as well to allow to provide the digital infrastructure for government to provide their services in a more efficient way as well. And finally, the third pillar is combating inequality through social justice. We talked about helping the B40, all the challenges with the cost of living, and how the government is helping to enhance the healthcare and education system and to strengthen really the social safety net. Okay, so looking at the when we look at the budget, there are two parts to it. Obviously, there is the revenue side of the equation, and there is the spending side of the equation. Insofar as revenue side of the equation is concerned, if you look at the number on the bottom right-hand corner, where it says total revenue 2023, that column on the right-hand side, the revised retabled budget estimate is total revenue is 291 billion ringgit. And if you just look further up that line, some of the rows up there, you'll find that the total non-tax revenue accounts for a good 73 billion. And total non-tax revenue is really largely comprised of dividends from Petronas, for example, and certain other investment income of the government. Now, the tax revenue, that's the part where it's of interest to us. We're looking at the 218 billion ringgit. And we noticed that, from 2023, the original budget estimate, and if we would compare it with the 218 retabled budget estimate, there is obviously an increase. So then the question is, where does this increase come from? If you look up the line, you can see corporate income taxes. There's an increase of from 88 billion to 96 billion estimate. Obviously, there is the petroleum income tax. It's lower than the previous year, obviously, because of the Brent crude oil price that was it averaged $100 a barrel in 2023. I think that's the assumption of about $80 a barrel. So the corporate income tax. So the question is, how do you account for that increase from 88 billion to 96 billion? And hence, aside from that, there is if you look at sales and service tax, the tax base is narrower than what GST was. The 2023 retabled budget estimate is 33 billion versus last year's collection of 31 billion. So we wouldn't be able to expect very much out of that in terms of an increase. Obviously, one of the ways to, and it was talked about, to perhaps increase the tax base would have been to look at the implementation of GST, to bring back GST again, because it's a broader base tax. If we could compare it with when it was GST was taken out a few years ago, I think the differential in collection would have been possibly about 10 billion ringgit extra. So then the question is, when the government looks at these revenue gaps, where are the possibilities if GST is deferred? Then the question is corporate income tax. What can be done? One of the things, obviously, if you look at the budget announcements, one of the ways the government wants to increase revenues is obviously to enhance and make it more efficient to collect revenues as well. One of the ways that was introduced was this thing called the voluntary program. And we'll talk about the voluntary program in the next couple of slides. We'll take a look at the comparison between that and the previous voluntary programs. Now, the other thing is, of course, then when the government looks at the other possible areas to expand the tax base, obviously the government talked about capital gains tax, a possibility. We will touch on that afterwards in a later slide as well. We'll run through some of these more interesting elements and maybe highlight some of the issues that we foresee as we go along. So we were talking about the revenue side of the equation. So we will look at the expenditure part of the equation. I think that was brought up by Dato Johan as well just now. Like Dato Johan said, there is a concerted effort to bring down the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. If you look at the budget speech and the details in there, there is also a midterm fiscal framework that the government is looking at to bring down the deficit from 5% to between 3 to 4% by 2025, if I'm not mistaken. So there is a concerted effort to look at that area. To bring down the budget deficit, obviously there are two parts to it. You can increase revenue on the one hand, which is what we're talking about. The government is looking at ways to new ways to grow the tax base. On the other hand, it is comforting to know that the government is also very conscientiously looking at all the areas of expenditure and making sure that any wastages are taken away. Also interesting to note, looking at all these numbers, we'll look at Malaysia's tax collection. Our tax base is actually quite small as a percentage of GDP. Our tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, and these are figures from the OECD, and these are 2020 statistics, and I wouldn't expect it to vary very much from that. So tax as a percentage of GDP in Malaysia was about 11 to 12%. If we were to compare it with the OECD average, for example, the OECD average is about 33% or thereabouts. A comparison with the average for Asian nations, the tax to GDP ratio is actually about 19%. So there is, so Malaysia has that gap to look into, to consider. And of course, when the government looks at ways to bridge that gap, we have to make sure that there are whatever measures are put in are sustainable, and whatever it is, it must promote, obviously continue to promote economic development going forward as well. So just running through some of the tax proposals, and mindful of time. One of the things that were brought up during in the budget speech was voluntary disclosure program. The voluntary disclosure program was introduced before for income tax in 2018 and 2019. For a lot of you may remember, a special voluntary disclosure program was also introduced in respect of indirect taxes. in just last year. So obviously the inland revenue and the Royal Malaysian Customs Department feel that the programs were successful and it met the objectives, and therefore the authorities feel that the voluntary disclosure program, it's good to introduce it again. And if you look at the proposal in the budget this time round, it was proposed that the voluntary disclosure program be open from 1 June 23 to 31st of May 24. And in this program that is proposed, it was proposed a waiver of 100% penalty. So a lot of companies and perhaps individuals will be encouraged to come forward for this voluntary disclosure when it's open. And just to look at the question of, just to address the question of how successful was were the inland revenue and the customs voluntary disclosure programs before. If we were to look at on the left-hand side of the screen, IRB's collection, the IRB's participation, although they targeted 1 million initially, as in voluntary disclosure entities or people, the number of participation was about almost 300,000. And the outcome, the tax collected was circa 7.9 billion, as opposed to the original target of 10 billion, which means that on a per capita basis, it was much higher than what was originally expected. RMCD, on the other hand, the participation last year was about about 10,000 or thereabouts, from what we understand. And the amount collected is just shy of 1 billion. The estimate is probably about 700 plus billion ringgit. So these programs were proven to be successful in the past. And hence, the government has brought it back, and it will encourage people to come forward to make any underpaid taxes and so on. Just very quickly, some of the issues that when taxpayers come up and do a voluntary disclosure, some of the issues that are sometimes encountered are the errors regarding recognition of income. Could be the timing of recognition of income that is done wrongly. Could be characterization of income of gains, because capital versus revenue gains are taxable under Income Tax Act, capital gains are not. So there are all these dynamics, and for taxpayers there may be also deductibility of expenses that were claimed, but some expenses may have been claimed on a more aggressive basis, and some may have been claimed wrong, and therefore these are avenues to perhaps do a voluntary disclosure and make good the tax without any penalties. So this is one of the ways for the government to speed up collections as well, and it's proven successful in the past. Same thing with customs. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Same issues if there are mistakes made in compliance in terms of customs declaration, compliance on bi-monthly filings, or anything relating to service tax, sales tax, or the old GST. This may be a good time to do a health check, and if you discover any underpaid taxes, it's a good time to then take advantage of the special voluntary disclosure program. All right. Now, coming on to the topic of capital gains tax. Like you said, the government mentioned this in the budget, that it was something that they were looking into. The capital gains tax, the scope that was mentioned in the speech was, they were looking at capital gains tax on only disposal of unlisted shares by corporate shareholders. Obviously, the government has mentioned quite clearly that they will not do this in haste. They will obtain the views of all stakeholders. And as tax practitioners, we realize that there are a lot of issues that can crop up in relation to this. Whether, for example, capital gains tax, whether the capital gains tax regime that is contemplated will be embedded within the Income Tax Act, whether it's separate, how do you deal with losses, and there are a lot of investors in private companies in Malaysia, for example, the private equity community as well. They will certainly be concerned about some of these developments. But also the other thing that the government will need to take into consideration, or the Inland Revenue will need to look into, is in terms of companies that then, private companies that go into group restructurings, internal restructurings, and there are movement of unlisted shares due to all these restructurings. It would not be just or right to tax a capital gain on an internal restructuring. So these are some of the things that need to be looked at, and there are a lot of moving parts to it. And I believe that all stakeholders will be interested to contribute to the discussion. But also interesting, relating to the capital gains tax that was mentioned, is that in the budget speech, it was mentioned that if a CGT were to be introduced, it would be introduced at a low tax rate. We don't know what low tax rate means, but hopefully it is not burdensome. It is something to watch out for. Okay, I'm not going to run through in any detail the proposals. Just to highlight some of the things that the government were introduced in the budget speech. Reduction in tax rates for SMEs, to encourage SMEs to then reinvest, and it is very much in line with the objectives of the government as well, to encourage SMEs to flourish and to contribute significantly to the economy. And so related to that, just running through some tax incentives. So there are multiple incentives introduced in the budget, obviously, and quite a number of them obviously have the theme of dealing with sustainability. So where there is investments in the area of sustainable sustainability or green investments, such as carbon capture, storage facilities and investments. There are plenty of incentives on offer. Other tax incentives that were introduced in there, again, to the green theme, things like manufacturing of EV charging equipment. Again, plenty of incentives in terms of either income tax exemption or what we call investment tax allowance exemption. Incentive that can be set off against 100% of your statutory income. So these are very good incentives to encourage the manufacturing of a lot of these either high-tech equipment, or things that within industries that will contribute to the industrial clusters that will facilitate the growth of the Malaysian economy. Without going into any detail, I'm just flashing this out just to show some of the other types of incentives that are extended that can be enjoyed by the SMEs as well. Automation equipment in manufacturing services and agriculture, this is again it brings into fore the importance of helping all these, whether it's SMEs who want to invest in these areas, to scale up and to improve on digitalization, automation, Industry 4.0. It will help them then contribute back to develop the ecosystem that will help develop the economy. There are a few within the budget proposals, there are also these within the sustainable economic growth pillar. There was also the mention of the high impact investments, and our high impact investments. There are two particular areas which the finance minister mentioned. One is investments in the aerospace industry, and secondly, the electronics and electrical E&E industry. This whole all these proposals and incentives are meant to allow all these companies to help create those industrial clusters, build talent, and help Malaysia grow its industrial base as we move forward in Industry 4.0 type environment. Food production was one of the things mentioned in the proposals as well. It was important because it focused on the issue of food security, and therefore the government introduced the extension of the application period for major food production projects. I'm not going to run through all the incentives in the interest of time, but what I will do is tax exemption on EVs. Yep, again, the common theme throughout the whole budget speech on sustainability, on green investments. There's a lot of obviously proposals and incentives to encourage investments and to encourage people to buy EVs and to encourage that ecosystem. The one interesting thing that the government did mention as well in the budget proposal was the possibility of the introduction of luxury tax as part of its efforts to increase the tax base. I think this received a lot of interest in the media, but we have to wait and see what the scope is and the reach of the luxury tax. Finally, just a couple of things I want to mention. The non-tax incentive side, the Ministry of Finance has also mentioned an important part that was discussed for quite a while, which is the introduction of a global minimum tax under Pillar 2 of BEPS. Although no date has been set, I think it's a space to watch out for all the multinationals that are operating in Malaysia, which come within those thresholds. And also there was a mention about investment incentives to be restructured to a tiered tax rate that will be focused on investor commitments based on outcomes such as creating high-value jobs, embedding local firms in the supply chain, creating new industrial clusters, which is goes with the theme that we've been talking about throughout the budget. Yep. So sorry, just maybe some final words. I think overall budget 2023 appears to be very measured, and the focus on fiscal responsibility, I think, is indeed welcome for us to look forward to a sustainable growth environment that will allow us to continue to attract foreign investments. So with that, I'd like to pass back to Angie. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wong. Wow, with all the information shared by Dato Johan and Mr. Wong, I'm sure many of our attendees have burning questions waiting to be answered. Rules and regulations, just beforehand. Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed to the panel session, let me share some housekeeping rules. We highly encourage questions from the audience. So please post your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please be reminded to only use the Q&A function and not the chat box when submitting your questions. Towards the end of the session, we will share a link for feedback in the chat box, so do spare a minute to share your views and feedback to help us continue delivering quality programs. Now moving into our panel session, Team Strengthening Recovery and facilitating reforms for future economic and business resilience, let's welcome our distinguished panel, Dato Johan Merican, Treasury Secretary General from the Ministry of Finance Malaysia, Mr. Anthony Loh, Head of Territory for Malaysia and CEO of BNP Paribas Malaysia Berhad, and Mr. Kiranjit Singh, ASEAN Regional Head and of Ipsos Strategy 3. For the audience benefit, just to give you a short intro, Mr. Anthony has more than 20 years of experience in banking and finance, while Mr. Kiranjit has over 20 years of experience in managing and developing a diverse range of businesses, especially in manufacturing, industrial, and services sector, with stints in Europe, US, and Asia. Moderating today's panel is Mr. Amarjit Singh, EY ASEAN Tax Leader and Partner of Ernst & Young Tax Consultants Sendirian Berhad. With more than 20 years of professional experience in the field of taxation, Amarjit is often consulted on policy matters, tax structuring and incentives, as well as group reorganizations and IPOs. Over to you, Amarjit.
Thank you, Angeline. Just a quick sound test. You can hear me, right?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, firstly, BMCC, for having all of us. A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And also thank you, Angeline, for doing the quick introduction of this very, very esteemed panelist. Starting with Yang Berbahagia Dato Johan Mahmud Merican, who is now the Ketua Setiausaha Perbendaharaan. This was on the 27th of February, Monday this week. So heartiest congratulations to you, Dato.
Thank you, sir.
And I'm told you're probably the youngest to ever to hold this position. Is that true?
I'm not sure, but in private sector, getting a job at 50, rarely will we say it's the youngest. But yes, perhaps in Purujaya, it is considered a feat.
Okay, no, but congratulations again. Really, I think it's a fantastic achievement, and it's a little bit warm given that we've known you and worked with you for so many years. So really, congratulations, Mr. Anthony Loh. Thank you for joining us again this year, and of course, Kiranjit, who leads Ipsos Strategy 3 in Southeast Asia. I'm told it's the advisory arm of Ipsos. In fact, I was doing a little bit of research, Kiran, and you guys won some awards at the Forbes, being the global most preferred management consulting firm or something like that. So congratulations as well.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, so with this esteemed panelists, and we've only got like 35 minutes, and so we will go on a sort of a rapid fire basis. We'll cover a couple of themes. Of course, one is I would like to get an overall view from each one of the panelists. Dr. Johan has had his say in presenting the views from the government side. I thought it would be really good if we can get perhaps Anthony, for you to go first. It'll be good to hear your views, and especially from a sort of a global regional fund manager perspective, perhaps, Anthony.
Hello, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot, Amarjit, for inviting me to this conference, and a very good afternoon to my fellow panelists, Dato Johan, as well as Kiranjit. On the question about how external fund managers or external investors view the budget announcement, I would say it strikes the right chord and the right balance between being responsible from a fiscal standpoint, while also trying to address some of the pertinent issues that is being faced by the rakyat, particularly by the B40 and the M40. And you can imagine this is not an easy task, because on one hand, you're trying to balance the books, while on the other hand, you need to be sensitive to the needs on the ground. And I think the government has done a very nice balance, striking the right chord in terms of hitting what I would call the twin objectives, right? Hence, you see the proposal for the tax increase for those in the higher income bracket, giving a bit of breathing room for the B40 and the M40. Also, you see the introduction of the luxury goods tax and potentially the incoming study arising from the study of the new capital gains tax. I think the idea of the reintroduction of the special voluntary disclosure program is indeed a good move, because that would encourage more more what do you call tax collection and encourage more stakeholders to be in compliance, and that would increase the taxes for the government for the long term in order to ensure it's inclusive and sustainable for the long term. So all in all, it was a good budget. Back to you, Amjit.
Thanks, Anthony. So sounds like measured, balanced, responsible, sustainable. That's the key words I'm hearing, and this is quite consistent. But very quickly, moving on to you, Kiran. Given your position as ASEAN head of Ipsos, I thought it would be good to perhaps get a little bit wider view of an ASEAN perspective vis-a-vis Malaysia, in comparison.
Sure. I would like to echo some of the the key points by the other panelists and also Dato Johan and so on. But what I'm comforted in is actually the underlying message of the budget or the intent of the budget. So in a nutshell, it's better governance, more efficient delivery systems for the government, and rebuilding middle class. So these are the three pillars which I comforted in, because those are the signals which we are giving to the marketplace, right? The budget is premised on a growth rate of 4.5%. So there's been a lot of debate whether 4.5% is optimistic or realistic and so on. In my point of view, it is very much doable. Personally, I feel that 4.5% is a bit on the low side. You can even go higher. The reason I'm saying this is because we work with a lot of companies who want to expand and grow in not in Malaysia, but also in APAC. So one thing we realized is at the firm level, most of them did their budgeting in Q4 last year. And when they were doing their budgeting, they have discounted or they have taken the view that China will not be reopening so fast, so rapidly this year. And that has changed quite, overnight, right? So what we're seeing is a lot of companies are recalibrating their investment policies and growth plans and so on. So that is why I feel that there's energy and momentum in terms of the economy. In fact, I'm pleased to say that we are reactivating a new market entry for one of the global biggest coffee chain in the world to have an entry position in Malaysia, perhaps not this year, but early next already. So I'm seeing the momentum there. If there's one, I guess, barrier or the risk which the people are still trying to manage is the risk of inflation. So as long as we can keep inflation under check to some extent, I think that should not give any concerns to us in terms of the long-term perspective, at least for the next few months. That's my point of view.
Thanks, Kiran. So, sounds quite optimistic, Kiran. That's what I'm hearing. But just to contrast, by right, I shouldn't be giving too many views. It's better for you guys to speak, but I can't help myself. Just observation, right? But I deal with a fair bit of local companies, and I also deal a fair bit with the MNCs that are here. And some of them are already, when I speak with them, they're showing their numbers coming down, as in, they sort of ramped up for post-pandemic demand, and now they are showing a little bit of a oversupply of inventory. The demand is slowing down. At least Malaysia, business still goes on as normal. But what I'm hearing from places like Vietnam, actually, I've heard that the real estate sector got hit. The manufacturing companies, some of them actually shut down, laid off jobs. And we are still hearing from global side, some of the tech companies are laying off jobs, right? So, just to also share what I'm hearing, and perhaps we will get the real expert, Dato Johan, to give his perspective.
First I was, Amanjit, you spoiled it a bit. I was already going to be so happy saying, I'm so happy to hear from Kiranjit being bullish about Malaysia. Obviously, he shares Prime Minister's confidence, but I think it's backed by Prime Minister's commitment, in presenting this responsible budget, a focus on governance reform. And whilst I note, some things that Chow Yang had raised during his earlier presentations, yes, there was this announcement on the luxury tax and also capital gains tax. I'd like to reassure everyone that certainly Ministry of Finance will undertake significant stakeholder engagement before these are finalized. But I think this was the Prime Minister signaling a policy direction For one, you all know my previous minister was a former banker, so quite a capitalist. I think the Prime Minister was keen to articulate that he's not a capitalist. He has strong views on social justice. And as leading up to the budget, many people were asking him, please introduce GST. And I think what he's come out to say is that, look, now is not the time. So even though we've kept inflation relatively contained at 3.3%, but there's an underlying 5.8% food inflation, which will be affecting the lower income. So now is not the time to introduce a broad-based tax, which almost by definition is regressive. So he said, let us maybe just start first by those who can afford a little bit. But even then, it's more of a signal, because I know there's some grumblings about the individual tax rate, but as you know, the ones that pay are really those with taxable income of 230,000 and above. And even then, it's, I think, less than 150,000 taxpayers that face a slight increase in tax. That's 1% of our labor force. So it's not really taxing the T20. We're taxing a little bit more on the T1. So and I'm also, but by and large, still I'm very happy with what Anthony and Kiranjit mentioned about it being a measured and balanced budget. But hopefully this is also a signal of the direction the government is going in, and you can look forward to more reforms going forward. Thank you.
Thanks. So in support, so I don't want to be seen as the spoiler amongst the esteemed crowd here. So in preparation for this coming budget, I was doing a little bit of reading, right? And as you know, I'm not an economist. I'm a plain vanilla tax guy. But some of the measures that were proposed in this budget, especially taxing the T1 or the T20, the luxury good. When I looked at some of the studies by the OECD, in fact, it was fully aligned. That was definitely one of the measures that was sort of proposed or recommended, especially for developing economies. So we're not going against, I would say, global trends. In fact, our neighbor down south had their budget probably 2 weeks before ours, and they introduced also luxury taxes on automotives for sure. Given their circumstance, their version of luxury tax was also on property, so they upped the stamp duty on property. So I would say in terms of general measures, we especially fiscal, we're on aligned, I guess, with global.
No, thanks, Amarjit. But actually, maybe a counterpoint to what you mentioned about technology. On the other hand, there seem to be some opportunities. The Prime Minister, in the lead up to budget, he met with some of these tech companies. It includes the likes of Kasem. Then there was some which he was quite attracted by, particularly in Penang, where some of these companies that used to work for multinationals, and they set up their own. Some have listed, likes of Vitrox, Emilus, and I think one that recently listed was Opstar. And I think this is where one of the measures of things of how GLCs should also play their role to support some of these homegrown startups, because obviously we do have the talent to do more in this space.
I agree 100%. So maybe we'll pivot to FDIs, if it's okay with everyone. So in the Prime Minister's speech, I think he echoed the downward trend of FDIs in his budget. I think there were a number of measures that were announced to stimulate investments in line with the new investment policy. And I think not just straight away jumping into fiscal incentives, but I think there were mention of structural change, to make it, to have a better, more efficient, more effective machinery to improve the ease of doing business. And I looked it out a little bit. Malaysia today stands, I think, as the probably number 4th recipient of FDIs in ASEAN. In terms of our share of total FDI inflow, based on some reports, we are looking at about 6%. So that gives me a little bit of a surprise. When I speak with the MNCs, they've always seen us being, the best. In fact, even when they compare with Singapore, they think things here are much better. So when I see some of the stats, it's not jiving. So perhaps if I can, Kiran, to get your perspective, from an ASEAN perspective. What's your view? And, is it one of the comments we hear is maybe we're just not getting the narrative right. And given I saw a little bit of the work that you do, branding and all of those things, right? So I thought it would be good to hear your perspective. You're on mute.
Okay. Malaysia has definitely a good story to tell. Okay. I think perhaps a bit more discipline in our messaging is necessary. One thing which I think we need to get our act together is there's multiple investment promotion agencies, both at the federal, state, focusing on certain specific clusters and so on. So I think we need to synchronize what is our messaging, keep it simple, and repeat the same story again and again, right? So I think that is one thing which we need to do, right? There's always an issue about talent. People always say talent, is an issue in Malaysia and so on. Dr. Johan will know that I've done a lot of talent studies, not only in Malaysia, but also regionally and globally. In any country or any talent study which I do, whether in UK or anywhere else, Malaysia is not unique in the position that there is some challenges in terms of talent. Every country faces some kind of challenge in terms of their talent pool, right? So I think talent should not be, we should not hold us too back in terms of encouraging investments and so on. If there's one thing which I'm hearing from foreign investors and so on is the story about we have a small domestic base compared to Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam and so on. So we have a smaller domestic base, right? So my comeback to them is that, yes, we have a small domestic base, but we have a sophisticated and a sizable middle class. Sophisticated and sizable middle class, and that can be, Malaysia can be truly an Asia destination to put their base in and export, right? So, for example, it is not easy for Chinese companies simply to move from China to Vietnam or elsewhere and so on, even Indonesia, because it is not setting up a factory, but the whole ecosystem is necessary in that. So I think in that aspect, we need to do better. And the other thing is, I guess, again, about messaging, there's a thinking that we want to be a champion of everything. We want to be a hub for everything under the sun, right? So we need to understand where we can play and where we really do have the right to win, because our resources are finite, you know what I mean? And so we need to focus on areas where we can really win, rather than just being having a scatter approach.
Yeah, no, I like your point on us being focused. In fact, I think in his speech, in the Prime Minister's speech, when he spoke about the FDI, he then also specifically mentioned two sectors. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was the E&E, and I think it was the aerospace sector that he mentioned. And we did a little bit of just a comparison. And, we were looking at Singapore, and apparently these guys, they've been focusing on like 5 key sectors for I don't know how long. Whereas, maybe, we've been a little bit more broader and so, but it sounds like, but Dato Johan, if you want to add, I mean, we're just getting it from the speech, it'd be good to hear your insights.
No, thank you, Amajid. No, as you know, MITI Maida, they do have their priority sectors, which do include electronics, chemicals, machinery, and the higher growth sectors include aerospace and medical devices, amongst others. But I think your general comment is correct that sometimes the general, in fact, the feedback that we get, even like from World Bank, when they look at us, they do feel that sometimes our incentives are not sufficiently targeted, which is probably a reason why we have a corporate tax rate of 24%, but really an effective tax rate of 15%, which, which that contributes to what was mentioned earlier, how we have one of the lowest effective tax in the region. We're at 11.3%. And even Singapore is seen as a low tax jurisdiction, is at 13% of GDP. So there is certainly a need for more focus. I think that's due. Prime Minister also articulated how MITI should be coming up with their industrial master plan review come third quarter. That hopefully will provide greater definition in terms of our priorities, and obviously we in MOF would align to that. But the other thing that the Prime Minister also articulated was this how we should move to more tiered tax incentive based on outcomes. I think, Amajid, you're more of an expert in this, and you know sometimes what we do is that we give an incentive. The moment they don't achieve it, it goes like zero. So I think this is something that we're trying to be a bit more, again, investor friendly, having something that's a bit more outcome. It's more like it's by both a carrot and a stick. So on one hand, it's not so punitive in a sense. If you don't meet it immediately, it goes to zero. But at the same time, it does give this incentive for the organization to really meet its commitments. And I think where another thing which the PM was mentioning is that we still have this issue about a general low level of pay amongst Malaysians. Yes. And even highlighted how 90% of our TVET graduates earn below 2,000, making them wonder why do they invest the time to study if they're still going to end up earning less than a waiter. So how could we also reform our incentives? Because it's some of our main incentives tools is investment tax allowance, where it rewards the company that brings in a big capital, but not necessarily great linkages to SMEs and creating good jobs. So how do we shift towards having those incentives to really link to the creation of higher paying jobs and providing that extra linkage and value for SMEs? I think that's something that, so he's tasked us to look at it. Not an easy task, but it certainly makes sense and certainly something that we need to work on.
Yeah, I was really very encouraged when I read the word about restructured towards tiered tax based on outcomes. I've always felt that our incentives are very prescriptive. It's like you've got a list of 10 things, you need to meet every one of it, then you get into the and if you miss out one, whereas this outcome based, if you can do it like a sort of a balanced scorecard, we give you something, but in return we expect an ROI of so much, and these are the 5 things that the nation is going to get. But it's not easy, right? Because every investor is different, and trying to make sure we are equitable to all.
Okay, Amajid, so experts like you need to help us and contribute some suggestions.
Well, always. Okay, moving on. Anthony, maybe getting a little bit of perspective from you as well. In the speech, it was mentioned TRX, Malaysia's Global Financial Hub. There was also funding from Bank Pembangunan, I think about something like 6 billion ringgit for strategic financing to encourage the sustainable agenda, automation. So I just want to hear your perspective. Are these measures good enough? Is there more that you think we should do?
Yeah, thanks, Amajid. I think these measures are indeed commendable because it is quite important that the government, through its own agencies, continue to support and finance industries or segments that are strategic, and also form as a catalyst in order to have the maximum impact or multiplier effect to the country's economy and GDP. The allocation of such big amounts in a very focused way allows the disbursement of the funds to the targeted segments or industries that we were earlier speaking about, so that you get bang for the buck, right? In order to ensure that you create the kind of jobs or the multiple effect that we were talking about. I think back to the discussion on the FDI, I think one point I want to mention also is that it is not just the quantity of the FDI, it's also the quality of the FDI that is quite important, particularly given what Dato Johan was talking about in terms of the kind of jobs we want to create, right? Which is more the high skill kind of or high value kind of job creation in order to lead to the kind of wealth creation that the country is trying to create, and also to promote social mobility. Because with that, of course, over a longer sustainable period, it creates also more tax revenue for the government, which would then make it quite an inclusive and sustainable trajectory.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Anthony. So I'm going to pivot to the next one, digitalization. I think, Dato, if I may get your thoughts on this, it's digital has traditionally, at least from the pandemic time, very obvious focus on digitalization. And this round we also hear about the government's commitment to accelerate the implementation of the Jendela project as a national effort to provide access to the internet. We've also heard about financing grants for businesses to support business automation and digitalization activities. Now, one of the common feedbacks that I've heard, funding is definitely important, and this is the little I observe. The SME side, what they need is really funding. The big boys are the ones that always need the tax incentives because they have the ability to move. So I thought funding in terms of digital businesses was the right thing to do. But the one area which is a challenge, what I hear from the ground with the SME group and the businesses at large, is the how-to for digital, right? As in, I guess everyone is so used to doing their operations and all in the same old fashion. How can we? So it's really about the know-how behind, and hence my question is, are there any efforts in this space? Perhaps setting up a center of excellence on digitalization that can help Malaysian businesses to automate their processes, their operations.
No, thank you for the question, Majid. No, it's certainly a valid concern, or it's a proposal that has merit. I think for now, but these are probably targeted more at the micro SMEs. The MCMC has these what they call PADI, their Pusat Economy Digital. I think, and what Prime Minister announced is that by end of this year, there should be one PADI in each what we call a DUN, a state constituency. And what it's successful at doing, particularly during the COVID crisis, was that these centers helped small SMEs to be able to then market their products online. And whilst the COVID crisis was certainly an unfortunate tragedy for many, but it also seemed to be able to force many companies to adopt better digitalization. And one of the efforts along that is we've also maintained the SME digitalization grant, and it gives a matching grant of up to 5,000 for SMEs to adopt, whether it's a points of sale system, inventory, ERP, by subscribing online. This has been done in collaboration with the telcos, and it seems to have a quite positive uptake. So that's one of the positive initiatives that we had. You mentioned about again SMEs facing issues on funding. I think that's a main reason why we have programs such as the SJPP. We do hear this common refrain that the banks are sometimes a bit reluctant to provide funding. As you know, the SJPP provides government guarantee to the banks of up to 80%, where in a sense then the bank only has 20% risk on these loans given out. But in the budget, the Prime Minister also then enhanced it, that it's been increased up to 90% for key sectors, including manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, and high tech, recognizing that these are some of the sectors that we want to grow or need to recover. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Johan. Kiran, would you like to add, in terms of what more you think Malaysia can do in this space?
Sure. Digitalization is an expensive process, or automation itself is an expensive process. It's not easy, right? Especially we're talking about Industry 4.0. So if you're talking about Industry 4.0 in the true sense, is basically repurposing your whole factory or operations once again from the ground up, right? And it's expensive. So I think having support from the government is necessary. But what I would like to suggest is, while we have center of excellence, at the government facilities or government labs and so on, the best center of excellence for SME, especially SMEs, is they are always inspired by their peers. So we should make some of their peers centers of excellence themselves, right? Champion some of these companies themselves to be center of excellence, because that's where the SMEs, they get inspiration from. They feel that it's something which they can relate to. and so on. So those are the how-to aspect of things. I think that's something which we have to look about.
Okay.
The other thing is, sorry, if I just add one point is that we have to not talk about big words to them, like Industry 4.0. Let's talk about automation, for example, simple words, so that they can relate to that in a better, a better appreciation of what we are trying to do. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Dato, you should reach out to Kiran as well as you reached out to me. I'm kidding. Okay, so pivoting on to sustainability and ESG. So as in previous budget, there were some measures, right? Although on a personal front, I felt it was a little bit soft. And when I hear from some of my colleagues in the Europe, things seems to be moving at a much sort of a focused pace, if I can. And some of the things that I learned is the 70% of our Malaysia's exports are expected to go to countries that have committed to net zero emissions. This morning, I was reading one report, 76% of Asia Pacific deal makers are expected to spend more time over the next 3 years scrutinizing ESG factors as they look at a target company or as they look at due diligence exercises. So one of the sort of the feedback that comes back to us is the many sectors and companies in Malaysia are actually vulnerable to ESG risk. I must admit myself, I'm a latecomer to this area. I always thought that this is meant for the rich countries and we'll deal with it later kind of thing. But when I started to realize actually, the way the countries in Europe and to some extent, I think even the US are looking at this area, then it sounds like that there's risk for our companies, and hence we probably need to do more to protect I think our industry, right? So for that, maybe before I get Dato Johan to comment, just to hear from Anthony maybe first, share your observation given your exposure, and then Kiran, and then we'll get some feedback from Dato.
Thanks, Amajit. No, I think the government and the relevant stakeholders in Malaysia are quite aware of this, and from what I've seen, the relevant agencies and be it whether it's corporate or EC has been quite supportive of ESG and sustainability initiatives. So the overarching goal is clear. Like for example, Malaysia also has announced net zero by 2050, similar with quite a few GLC corporates and institutions. And so I think the point is, Malaysia as a country, alongside its various community, are on board. Then, of course, the question is really the pace, right? The pace, and also what are the milestone steps in order to reach those overarching goals. But there is no shying away from it, right? As we have seen quite a few corporates indeed publicly announcing it, yet embracing these targets and these challenges. I think there are various policies, initiatives and incentives that are being implemented. Some of them are indeed quite conducive in order to accelerate these sustainability best practices. But more importantly is the level of awareness, which I think the government bodies and regulators have been playing their part in terms of raising the level of awareness, not just with chieftains in the corporate circle, but also with the society at large, because it has to also be a bottom-up approach as much as it is top-down. So I think we are on the right track. The part that will need work on, which everybody is contributing to, is really the execution and the pace of it. Back to you, Amajit.
Thank you, Anthony.
So if I just can, yeah. I think if you're doing business domestically, you still have some time, couple of years more or 1-2 years more to get your act together. But if you're doing international business, the time is now. There's no delaying anymore. I can give you a true actual example. We've been appointed by the world's leading sustainable aviation fuel company, right? And they want to grow their network of partners and suppliers and contractors across APAC. And one of the first mandate they told us is if these companies themselves do not have some kind of ESG framework or aspiration for ESG, that's a hygiene factor. They can be superior and technically, they can be good in many aspects of financially and so on, but ESG is paramount. Otherwise, they are not able to do business with them. And also for our exporters, especially when exporting to developed countries, ESG is fast becoming quote unquote a non-tariff barrier for Malaysian exporters, right? And I think if you're doing international business, see it that is your business. For your future success, you need to implement ESG. Otherwise, you will not have a seat on the table.
Okay, no, thank you. Dato, maybe your perspective.
So I think Kiranjit is right. We really have no choice, especially if we're exporting. And we've seen some of our companies, whether palm oil or rubber gloves, having some challenges in exporting when there were questions on their ESG compliance. So I think certainly the government is very committed. You see EPU producing our SDG compliance or reports for the government. You see signals, for example, because it really requires a whole of nation approach. And you see in the budget speech, the Prime Minister mentioning the ecological fiscal transfers, our little start to efforts that's encouraging also the state governments to come on board in terms of sustainability. Obviously, Bursa and SC are very supportive in terms of identifying, FTSE were good, identifying which are the stocks which are more compliant. But one of the interesting ones that we see, again, talking about how some of the silver linings to the COVID crisis, Sime Darby obviously was one of many palm oil companies that had so much difficulty getting foreign workers in. And so one experiment which they tried, because we always say, we always assume that it's impossible to get Malaysians to work. And they found that if you pay enough, that's like, economics, there's a market clearing wage. So you said if you pay enough, 3,000 to 3,005, you can get Malaysians to work. But it needs to be accompanied with making the job less 3D. So they said you need to automate and mechanize it, and then drones, more tractors and more robot arms. That makes it more attractive, and that perhaps is it's part of the sustainability of that industry to then find practices that enable it to then require have more local workers and less reliant on unskilled labor. And on top of that, you also hear interesting developments in palm oil, which like for example converting the waste of palm oil into fertilizer. And the latest one I heard, they can even convert it to graphene. There's some interesting developments to make the industry more sustainable. I think government is fully supportive with setting aside a bit of fund to encourage more companies to go in that direction. And certainly that's where we need to get some of our key sectors, particularly the ones who are exporting, and happy for government to provide a nudge in that direction.
Thanks, Dato. Yeah, but just one more point, if I may add. I mean, funding is one. Sometimes I think it's also with the smaller players, the know-how, I think. And I think, some of the feedback I get, countries like Korea kind of, did it quite well. They've got like a centralized nation R&D sort of center, and everybody piggybacks on that and, and benefits kind of thing. Okay. Dato, there are questions coming.
Yes.
If there's one, if I may just, as we are having this discussion, just put that across. So it's a question on directly to yourself. If you could share the thinking behind the, I guess, the study on the capital gains tax for unlisted shares. There are concerns in the market that it will deter FDIs. Of course, Singapore has been quoted as a reference, but at the same time, I'll just add, right, the other ASEAN countries all have capital gains tax. But Dato, for you to take this question.
So I think you're right. For so long, we've always seen Malaysia, Asia as sort of very mercantile economy where we rely on the entrepreneurs to basically create jobs, and therefore the view is that don't tax their capital. But I think the Prime Minister is again coming in from perspective of social justice. Here we are taxing our workers and employees, and you want to move to an economy where increasingly you have knowledge workers and you're taxing them as employees on their wages. But then you then have this, sometimes it seems very artificial differentiation between income and capital. And Amajit, you know this in some companies, so let's say you're a company, you make widgets. For selling widgets, you will get paid tax. But if you then sell the subsidiary that makes that widget and make millions, then it's zero tax. So there seems to be a bit of too much of a dichotomy between the activity of making income and then capital gains is not taxed at all. And so I think this is something that, from an equity point of view, I think the Prime Minister feels it's something that we do need to perhaps nudge it in that direction. But he's very careful as well. He very clearly wanted to say unlisted because clearly no intention to spook the capital markets, and also very intentionally mentioned a lower rate. So it's more really a signal from dare I say it, a social justice perspective that those who make large capital gains should also then contribute a little.
Maybe if I can, Dato, just to get a little bit of perspective from Kiran and Anthony on this topic. This seems to be sounds to be the hottest one, this budget. Kiran?
Yeah, maybe I can go first, Abhijit.
Okay.
That's okay. I think as Dato Johan mentioned, and I think it was also addressed in Chow Yang's earlier presentation. The devils are in the details, right? Because we don't have the details of how the parameters, the what we call the approach in terms of how this will be operationalized. But I think I'm quite confident the government will consider the interests of all stakeholders in a fair and balanced manner. And clearly references will be made to some international best practices in terms of how some of these have been adopted successfully in some countries. In order to also address some of the concerns of the business community.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe just to pick up on what
Sure.
Anthony mentioned, I think as committed, we're certainly committed to extensive engagement. We know this is a major shift in policy. We want to take in views. I think already we understand that there will need to obviously be considering a threshold value below which you wouldn't tax capital gains. We want to take into account some of the points that Chow Yang was mentioning. If there are exemptions for purposes of, for example, restructurings. So I think these are certainly inputs that we look forward to possibly getting from the chambers, from also the tax experts in crafting this tax.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Manjit, if I can just add, Ipsos study shows that a majority of Malaysians, in fact, a majority of the global population feels that the current economic structure is not working for them. They don't feel that they're treated fairly. So capital gains tax, unlisted capital gains tax, and so on, is somehow it's I guess it's a way to level the playing field among how do we tax a blue collar worker or wage earner compared to say investor and so on. I think it's some way of making sure that there's a better level playing field than what we have today.
Okay, well, thank you. So it sounds like there is this. So it's a thin line, the way I look at it, like fine balance on the one side, equity, making sure we tax every part in a balanced way, in an equitable way, and then on the flip side, we're hearing businesses, transactions. Let's not sort of disencourage that. Malaysia still needs to be an attractive place for business. So actually, I'm really glad this time what we hear was a study is going to be taken. In some of the previous budgets, what the proposal is just announced, and then the feedback is gone, and then so this is good, and I'm sure all of us and people who are hearing, feel free to give your feedback to MOF so that all I guess all views are taken and we have the most optimum, right? Tax is never something that is going to be, people don't welcome it, but yeah. Okay, if I may, one more question sounds quite interesting, and it's to all the panelists. So The question is really, are there some top issues from which your views, whether it's government or industry in general, that can aim to solve using technology? I think really if I may interpret the question, I think it's really about digitalization perspectives from the panelists in terms of, what are the maybe top barriers in terms of us looking at accelerating our digitalization agenda. So perhaps Kiran, if you could go first, and then Anthony, and then Dato.
I think if I would like to see technology can certainly help in us reducing reliance of unskilled foreign labor. That's number one. Increasing productivity. So if we look like industrial robot intensity in Malaysia, it's still very much lower than even in Thailand, for example. So I think if we look into increasing productivity, doing less with more, increasing wages and so on, that's an area where I think technology can really make an impact in Malaysia. So beyond industrial robots, I think one area which I do not see a lot of conversation in Malaysia is service robots in the service industry. So a lot of countries which are facing challenges in terms of talent pool, aging workforce, and so on, they are already incorporating, and they have a systematic plan to use more service robots in the service industry. So I think these are the two areas which I would like to see more technology playing a better role in Malaysia.
Thank you, Kiran. Anthony?
Yeah, no, I think for us, indeed, Kiranjit has mentioned increasing productivity with more leveraging on robotic technology. I think for me, one area which we have been good at and we have been quite successful and we could do more is really leveraging on to get the relevant tech sectors whereby we can play a more important role in the global supply chain. For example, if you look at the semiconductor industry, Malaysia is indeed quite a relevant player in the entire global semiconductor value chain. And that will only grow. And if we can replicate that to other sectors or ancillary sectors on the back of the technology supply chain that we see globally, because as long as we are part of this momentum or push or drive of growth in digitalization and tech, and we will be carried by the wave, and we get to go along, and therefore it will create the kind of jobs that we want and also level productivity in the country. So we have to be relevant in the global supply chain. That's how we look at it.
Thanks. Dato, your take?
No, I think certainly there's a lot of scope for introducing technology to solve issues. I mean, just speaking on MOF's perspective, we understand there's a lot of potential value for e-invoicing.
Sorry, Dato, you went on mute. Okay.
Sorry. So in terms of, for example, e-invoicing, I think that's one area we can look at. That both potentially helps increase in terms of revenues, but at the same time, there's always this issue about the validity of voices inputs, especially if you have a GST structure. There's also a lot of conversations about how government can also initiate some new technologies. For example, Singapore has piloted blockchain for validation of trade documents. So I think there's some spaces where I think government also can take a lead in promoting the use of technology. Another area that we are also quite interested potentially is the use of technology for subsidies. For example, how do we have a means by which we still, Malaysians love their cheap petrol. So how do we ensure that, perhaps the B40 continue to buy subsidized fuel, but, you and me then being subject to high price. And maybe, I'm sure there are lots of technological solutions for that. But then, of course, that's in government. But again, there's so many opportunities in industry. It's very, we hear of, obviously we've got very well established E&E industry. And I think it's only at the periphery that we hear of some people using, for example, IoT for agriculture, for example. If there was any country that should be adopting technology for agriculture, it should be us. We have drones and things. We actually have those industries here, but we don't seem to apply them for our own So I think that's maybe something that we need to look at, leveraging on the technologies that are being produced in the country to benefit other sectors which perhaps are less automated.
Yeah, and maybe we need to also, Dato, I think, get some of our. I just feel from the outside there's a lot of support, a lot of focus. And let's bring the FDIs in, the new ones, right? But we've got some of our own homegrown players. Aerodyne is an excellent example, right? Our own company, and getting them involved to help the nation. I'm sure they will. Hopefully, I'm not putting Carol into a spot, but okay. So we are right at the tail end of this session. Perhaps if I can, just get each one of the panelists to, give their final key takeaway message, and then we'll bring this session to a close. Kiran, maybe yourself go first.
Sure. My view is beyond the details, the tactical approaches of the budget itself. I think the underlying message and the tone is much more important, because that's what the signals we are giving to the market, right? Corporate governance, making sure that we're streamlining overlapping agencies, making sure that government agencies do not have mission creep, controlling the deficits. So those are the things which I think, from an external point of view, they understand that we are serious about doing something. Next thing is we're rebuilding our middle class, or supporting a middle class. If there's one thing good for Malaysia, is comparable to, say, Vietnam, Philippines, and so on, our sophisticated and our sizable middle class. So we need to help build the middle class again. And the third thing is, which I'm comforted in, is actually some of the programs which they'll be rolling out, I think, with the economic minister and so on, where they have programs to make sure that the rakyat is less dependent on government support, but to be more independent in the long run. So those are the three things which I'm comforted in. The budget, in my opinion, there are baby steps along a long process. So I hope in the next budget in October, and 6 months from now, we have bigger and better giant leaps in the next budget.
Okay, thank you, Kiran. Anthony.
Yeah, I think the tax budget is indeed a very balanced one. It is fiscally prudent, yet address the cost of living and the difficulties faced by the B40 and M40 communities. I think it strikes the right balance and the right chord in satisfying the various stakeholders, in ensuring a sustainable growth trajectory for the country in an inclusive and sustainable manner.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Dato, your last message for all of us.
I think it's been mentioned all throughout. It's a budget that the Prime Minister hoped to position as fiscally responsible but pro-growth, with an emphasis on governance reform and also social justice, looking after the poor and those, and help protecting against higher cost of living. So I think that's and as I think Kiranjit placed it well. I mean, this is the first budget in the government uniform. These are the first steps, but certainly I think the Prime Minister at least has signaled the direction in which he wants to take the country, and we look forward to supporting it, in the reform agenda of the government going forward.
Thank you. So all very, very strong messages. Balance, sustainable, equity, and of course, first, Kiran, to your words, right? First baby steps as we progress further. So thank you all, Dr. Johan, Kiran, and Anthony, for spending your time with us. With that, I'll bring this session to a close and pass it back to Angeline. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Johan, Mr. Anthony Loh, Mr. Kiranjit Singh, and Mr. Amarjit Singh for the interactive and informative session. With that, we've come to the end of our webinar. Thank you everyone for being with us today. We hope this has been an informative and fruitful session. On behalf of BMCC, we would like to extend our appreciation to our partner, CCIFM, for collaborating with us to deliver this webinar. Don't forget to share your feedback via the link in our chat box. And thank you everyone. Take care and stay safe.